On the warm, humid morning of July 31st, 1992, nothing foreshadowed disaster. Bangkok lived its usual life. The heavy smell of kerosene on the platform, the hum of ground vehicles, the calm sequence of actions that the air harbors repeat day after day. At one of the parking lots, a Thai Airways Airbus A310 was preparing to take off. Almost new, neat, and cleanly washed after overnight service, with a purple and white livery shining softly in the sun. Its tail number is HSTID. For the crew, it was a regular flight TG311, which was supposed to take only about 2 hours. Bangkok, Kathmandu. Nothing unusual. Nothing that could hint that this plane would never see the sunset again. The passengers were gradually getting on board. Someone was nervously holding tickets in their hands. Someone was smiling, whispering to a companion. Someone immediately hit a bag on the luggage rack and sat down in an armchair, covering himself with a blanket. Children pressed against the portholes, trying to see the passing equipment on the platform. Adults checked belts and took out books. Everything was so familiar that it seemed that pilots could take off even with their eyes closed. They were guided by habit, method, and skills that had been perfected over the years. It was cool in the cabin of the Airbus, and the instruments were glowing in their usual shades of green and yellow. The captain, a 41-year-old man with more than 13,000 hours under his belt, was leaning forward in the left-hand chair. His face was calm, focused. He felt at home in his element. Over the years, he not only flew but also taught others. The status of a line instructor meant that he was trusted with the most important thing: to transfer skills and maintain clarity of thinking when it became difficult for others. He was a methodical man who did not tolerate erratic actions. For him, every departure is a small chess game. To calculate ahead, to think about the possible, to be prepared for the impossible. His partner, the first officer, a 52-year-old pilot with even more overall experience, was older, but in this cockpit, it was the captain who set the tone. The first officer did his part accurately and professionally. He was really a good pilot, but he lacked one trait that aviation particularly values: inner firmness, the ability to say no at the right moment, even to someone who is older, more experienced, and higher in status. The instructors noted that he was cautious, inclined to ask questions instead of statements, and gentle where the situation might require harshness. This is not a problem for most professions, but in a cabin where two people have to be mirrors of each other, it becomes a weak link. They performed pre-flight checks calmly and confidently. The weather along the route promised to be predictable. Layered clouds and a monsoon over India, but nothing unusual that they would not have encountered dozens of times. In case of waiting, the crew took an additional hundreds of kilograms of fuel, a decision that seemed like ordinary caution at the time, and later would become a symbol of a missed opportunity. At 10:30 a.m. local time, after accelerating down the runway, the Airbus lifted off into the humid, hot air of Bangkok. The shock struts extended, the landing gear retracted, and the plane headed northwest. The usual murmur of engines, the soft hiss of air conditioning, and the occasional voice of those who had not yet had time to immerse themselves in their business could be heard in the cabin. Flight TG311 gained altitude, cutting through the wet haze, disappearing into the layers of white-gray sky. Everything went perfectly smoothly on the train. Wide plains opened up from below, gradually giving way to the winding lines of Indian rivers. There is a familiar routine in the cabin: checks, short questions, routine conversations. Their path was straight: cross the north of India, and then begin a descent to Kathmandu, one of the most difficult points on the map of civil aviation. Ahead of them was a valley that looked like a huge bowl carved among the mountains. There is only one airfield surrounded by ridges, where there are no radars, only radio reports, only VOR/DME numbers, only the data that the crew itself reports to the dispatcher. No insurance from Earth. The captain knew that. He also knew how difficult landing in monsoon could be. Clouds hung low, visibility jumped, and air masses changed unpredictably. Therefore, he had previously unfolded the approach map on his knee. It shows a diagram of the approach to runway 02, points, heights, distances, radials. Several bold lines indicate the critical stages of the descent, the steps that need to be moved carefully without unnecessary acceleration and hitches. He briefed the procedure in advance, back at the train station, to buy himself silence and clarity when the most difficult part begins. While he explained the sequence of actions, his co-pilot listened attentively, took notes, nodding. But the role of the listener fixed an invisible but strong dynamic in the cockpit. The captain makes decisions, the captain explains, the captain leads. The co-pilot is doing it. And as the following events will show, it was in this subtle psychological structure that a crack appeared even then. Below the plane, the clouds lay in an endless layer, white, gray, sometimes darker than usual. Their peaks rose to 40,000 feet. Somewhere deep there, hidden under a layer of moisture, warm rains were falling on the plains of Bihar. Noisy mountain rivers crushed the road to the Himalayas. But it was familiar to the crew. Such weather was part of the job. In Kathmandu, I often had to wait, circle in the holding, wait for the clouds to rise at least a little. Today, it seemed everything would be the same. At 12:10 p.m., the crew gets in touch with Kathmandu air traffic controllers for the first time, 150 miles to the airfield. A smooth, calm message. The answer is just as calm. Everything is going according to procedure. At that moment, no one knows yet that each subsequent radio exchange will be like a thin crack on glass. Barely noticeable, almost harmless, but gradually expanding until the picture of what is happening is completely destroyed. There is absolute normality in the cabin. There is peace in the cabin. Airbus is confidently moving forward, running through the instrument dials on autopilot. Only behind the clouds, which the crew has not yet seen, the first echoes of the complexity are already beginning to appear, which will turn an ordinary flight into a deadly maze. That maze will be built not only from mountains but also from words, pauses, misunderstandings, and human confidence that the right map is being used, even when the plane is not flying at all where a person thinks. But all this is later. So far, the TG-311 is smoothly cutting through the sky, and no one, neither in the cockpit nor in the cabin, feels that their path has already begun to deviate from the safe line, even by a centimeter. But in aviation, this is enough that after a few minutes the deviation becomes fatal. The descent began calmly, almost lazily, as it usually does on long, range approaches, when the crew knows in advance that the most interesting part of the flight is about to begin. Kathmandu is not an airport where you can afford to relax. The ground under the plane is hidden by dense layers of clouds, and somewhere below them is a city, a valley, a winding terrain, hills that rise sharply upward, as if trying to meet the plane in the middle of the way. But for now, TG-311 was still far from these dangerous forms. When they were about 25 miles from the airfield, the crew began requesting permission to descend. It would seem to be a standard action, but there was no answer. Silence. One challenge. Second. Third. The voices change. At first soft, polite, then insistent, and still silence in the headphones. This was the first small glitch. The controller was just distracted, did not hear the frequency, did not listen to the channel. It's not technology, it's not mountains, it's not the weather. It's just human inattention. For pilots who need to start descending on time in order to accurately reach the profile of a steep, non-precision circuit, this is an annoying moment. Every 10 seconds missed means that the plane is already passing the point after which it will be necessary to deliberately catch up with the vertical profile. Not fatal, but it's unpleasant, and the captain was clearly displeased. It is only after the sixth call that the dispatcher finally answers. There is a noticeable tension in the crew's voice, and almost immediately another piece of news. The weather is rapidly deteriorating. The southern approach to runway 02, which the crew was counting on, is closed. Visibility drops to 1 kilometer in heavy rain. The wind turns almost 180 degrees. Low layers of clouds are circling over the southern hills. The dispatcher offers an option that makes any Kathmandu pilot feel sick inside. Approach runway 20 via circling. This is a visual maneuver in the valley, between the hills, in the monsoon, with manual control based on the sense of space. It's like a delicate ballet with wings. If you lose sight of the airport for even a moment, you no longer have the right to continue. The captain wrinkles his forehead briefly. He knows you can do this, but it's better to avoid it. He asks again, is it still possible to use a direct approach to runway 02? The answer is unequivocal. You can't. The south side is foggy. The north is cleaner. The captain is now thinking about more than just one landing. He thinks about the options, about the fuel, about alternate airfields. He asks the first officer, how much fuel is there to Calcutta? He flips through the documents, but by inertia he answers about Bangkok. Captain abruptly, no, Calcutta. How much? It's a small thing, but such little things put invisible markers in the cabin. The tone gets tougher. The first officer shrinks a little. He's not the captain. He wasn't used to arguing. He agrees, clarifies the numbers. The air in the cabin becomes a little denser. At 12:27 p.m., they pass the Romeo Point, 41 miles south of Kathmandu. This is an important detail that will later play a tragic role. But now it's just another moment marked on the map. The captain and the first officer review the approach pattern again, discuss the Sierra Point where the gradual descent begins. The captain makes a small reservation. Instead of the 202 th radial, he calls 022T. It seems to him that he just confused the entrance course and the radial, but this is probably the first touch to the orientation failure. A small mistake that, in the face of future chaos, could become part of a fatal puzzle. And then, a long-awaited sigh of relief. The dispatcher reports that the weather has improved and access to runway 02 is possible again. The south has cleared. The rainstorm has passed. The clouds have partially dispersed. That's the good news. But it is at this moment that a new stage begins. The captain himself gets in touch, interrupting the first officer. This is not procedurally correct. The co-pilot should be running the radio. But the captain is already annoyed. He feels that he needs to speak tougher and more precisely. They switch to adjusting the aircraft for approach. They descend, release the flaps, and suddenly a sharp signal, blinking on the panel, yellow lettering. The flaps stopped. A flip fold. Conversations about disappearing clouds and a secure profile instantly disappear from my mind. The flaps are the most critical part of the configuration for this approach. It is impossible to perform a 6.6-degree reduction without them. Too cool. The aircraft simply will not be able to maintain speed and vertical trajectory at the same time. The captain adjusts the altitude. They are looking in QRH. They're watching ECAM. There is only an indication of a landing with a limited configuration. No advice on how to restore performance in the air. Just a phrase about the need to disable part of GPWS in order to avoid false warnings. This will be one of those small elements that will later play a fatal role. At this time, The plane is already passing the point where it was necessary to begin the descent. Lost seconds become lost geometry. The entry was disrupted. The captain informs the dispatcher that he intends to leave for Calcutta due to a malfunction. This is a logical step, but suddenly, as if in response to his unresolved doubts, the flaps are working again. The co-pilot resets them 0, then 15. The indicators show the norm. The flip fold disappears as quickly as it appeared. The technical problem lasted less than 30 seconds, but she ruined the even, calm flow of the procedure. And everything that happens next will happen with this broken rhythm. The captain cancels the departure, decides, let's go back to the beginning and start over. Seemed reasonable, seemed right, seemed safe. But this is where the most insidious part begins. It is with this decision, as if it were still absolutely logical, that a fatal misunderstanding begins to form between the crew, the controllers, and the real position of the aircraft. They only wanted to return to the starting point of the approach, but they chose the wrong point, and they didn't notice, and they shouldn't have noticed. If you look only through the eyes of two people immersed in endless radio exchanges, numbers, heights, and the hope that everything is about to go according to plan again. But the plan has already collapsed. They just didn't know it yet. The cabin of the plane gradually turned into a space of small but growing inconsistencies, as if someone was slowly leveling the air, slightly changing the pressure, while it is not yet fully felt, but it begins to disturb intuitively. The captain says, let's turn back to Romeo and start over. For him, Romeo is a conditional starting point from where it is convenient to restart the entire approach. This is what the diagram on their branded map looked like. The Sierra point and the Romeo point were drawn strangely close, through a small gap marked with the vague phrase "scale distorted." This distortion became the first shadow of an impending mistake. In fact, Romeo was 41 miles south of the airfield, much further than the actual Sierra procedure began, 16 miles. But the captain could see a completely different geometry on the paper. It was precisely such inconsistencies, barely noticeable but very insidious, that caused misunderstandings even among experienced crews. The pilot looks at the map, sees what he is used to seeing, and the brain completes the picture to the usual logic. The dispatcher, who does not have a radar and sees the world only through reports, also completes his picture. And both of these pictures may be false, but they look plausible. The captain is broadcasting, "We ask for a left turn to Romeo." The dispatcher does not understand why the crew suddenly wants to go so far back, and in response gives permission to start Sierra approach. He thinks he's just confirming what the crew already intends to do: return to the starting point of the procedure. Both sides believe that they have heard each other, but they talk about different things. And this is the perfect description of how aviation misunderstandings are born. Quiet, unnoticeable, but deadly. The captain is trying to clarify. We can't make the approach now. We need to make a left turn back to Romeo and start all over again. The dispatcher again, without understanding, repeats almost the same thing that he said before. Report to the DME. His task is simple. He heard the report, confirmed it, and put a dot on the paper chart. Cannot give a vector. He can't say, the U-turn is approved or it's not allowed. He doesn't have the picture that modern dispatchers have. All he has are crew reports, paper, and radio markers. Therefore, he repeats his phrase over and over again until he hears the number he can write down. But the crew took it as ignoring the request, and the captain's tension is growing. He's on edge, and there's a sharpness in his voice. Answer please, answer please. A small phrase said at the wrong moment. She doesn't violate the procedures, but she shows the frustration of a person who is used to everything going according to the rules, and now the rules seem to refuse to work. The first officer, as if feeling the growing tension, asks quietly, almost in a whisper, "Are we above the minimum safe level at all?" And on the left, he's talking about Mocha, about the minimum height above obstacles. That is, about the terrain. The very terrain that is now hidden behind the clouds, and which they should think about even if the map suggests that everything is safe. The captain looks outside, looks for something among the clouds with his eyes, and answers confidently, "Yes, everything is clear." This is the moment when reality takes the first step away from the perception of the crew. The first officer is doubtful. The captain is confident. And this combination creates a shaky foundation for further chaos. The voices on the air continue to get confused. The dispatcher requires a DME report. The crew demands a U-turn. Each time, the dispatcher sounds the same, as if he stands on his own. Report the distance. Perform Sierra approach. The crew hears the response as if it were a refusal. The tension reaches a point where the captain stops waiting for the dispatcher to allow a U-turn, and he just makes the decision himself. We climb ahead. We continue to set. He turns the course selector to the right. The autopilot smoothly puts the aircraft on a course of 045 degree, a course that does not lead back, not to the south, not to where they think, and to the northeast. Initially, it could have been an intermediate course. Perhaps it is an attempt to repeat part of the procedure of leaving for the second round, which includes a right set turn. But all this had to be done over the airfield, and they were 5 miles south of him. Every second takes them further away from the point where they can understand that something is wrong. And at that moment, a new topic appears on the frequency. Another aircraft, the Royal Nepal 206, is already entering the procedure, and the dispatcher requires to hold 11,500 feet due to separation. Thai 311 has already passed 13,000. The first officer replied, "Okay, we're holding 13,000. There is a feeling that the crew and the dispatcher existed in two parallel worlds. In one case, there are straight lines on the map. In the other, there is a real Airbus whose board is increasingly entering a sector where the minimum safe altitude is more than 21,000 feet. But none of the participants in the radio communication is aware of this yet. Soon, the dispatcher asks the question on which everything depends. Can you confirm your distance by DME? The captain looks at his instruments. 5 DME. It is at this moment that the final separation of the world as it is and the world as it seems takes place. For the dispatcher, the number 5 is an error, and he's sure he misheard. Confirm 25? The captain irritably, 505. The dispatcher, not wanting to aggravate the dispute, simply accepts the answer. And he does this exactly at the moment when the plane has already passed the VOR, crossed the 0 mark, and now, increasing the DME, was flying further north to where the inaccessible slopes of the Himalayas were located. No one notices that the painting is crumbling. All participants are confident that they understand each other. But in fact, they are already talking about different sides of the horizon. The plane continues to move north, to where the valley walls turn into stone bastions. The captain tries to use the FMS, but the dots don't appear where he expects them to. The lines on the screen don't match intuition. The course seems wrong, but the brain is looking for an excuse. The computer is buggy. The co-pilot introduces Samara, but he doesn't appear either. Enters Romeo. The line is drawn wrong way. Both pilots believe that this is an FMS error. In fact, it wasn't the computer that was wrong. They were already on the opposite side of the valley. But when logic breaks down, a person always looks for an external reason to protect their inner confidence. And a single question from the co-pilot begins to sound louder and louder in this fragile silence of the cockpit. "Hey, Are we really going north? It seems strange to him. He feels that something is wrong. But the captain answers calmly, "We'll turn back soon." This is the last point where they could still stop, exhale, and ask themselves, are we exactly where we think we are? But they are already too deep in a logical trap. Too many factors were taken with confidence. There are too many small confirmations of a false picture. And ahead there is only fog, rocks, and the inevitable turn of events. The seconds are running out, and very soon, reality will come knocking on the door, loudly, without the right to make mistakes. Despite the fact that the logic of the position in space had already cracked, the crew continued to act as if their mental map coincided with the world around them. The autopilot was heading 025 degree, which they imagined would take them south, back to the start of the procedure. But 025 degree is northeast. Their own course, spoken aloud and broadcast on the radio, was actually a warning to themselves, thrown into the void. But under conditions of overload, the brain simply did not connect the number 02-5 with the direction in which this course really led. There were no more soft slopes and hills behind the clouds. The harsh contours of the Himalayas began there, cold stone walls rising higher and higher, and the Airbus confidently flew straight into this white fog hiding the steep slopes. There was still a conversation between the pilots about navigation, about points, about FMS, about DME, as if reality somewhere outside was less important than fighting with their own tools. The first officer tried to get FMS to show Romeo or Samara. He entered the names over and over again, scrolled through the list, selected latitude options, and transferred the data from the captain's screen to his own. But the FMS, which was in perfect working order, showed exactly what it was supposed to show. The lines stretched behind them. The path was from behind. But the plane continued to fly forward. The system visualized reality, but the crew denied it. Out loud, in quiet words, but inside, it's already firm. Navigation is faulty. The card is not working. The dots are incorrect. The first officer, sensing that something was going wrong, stared intently out the window, as if trying to find a clue among the disorderly white ragged cloud layers. At some point, he saw something that alerted him on a deeper level. Maybe a change in shadows, maybe the movement of clouds, maybe just intuition. And suddenly, quietly but clearly, "Are we going north?" The captain didn't even turn his head. He kept turning the selector, trying to get hold of the correct logic in radials, courses, and DME. "We'll turn back," he said confidently, as if the very fact of his conviction could keep the plane in a safe part of the sky. But at that second, the crew was already inside the box canyon. Narrow, deep, enclosed on all sides by stone walls. Outside, the clouds hid the real terrain from them, but the terrain was already a few seconds away. The Airbus was walking into a trap from which diesel turbines and human will could no longer lead it out. And suddenly, a sharp male voice, metallic, emotionless, alien, bursting out of the cockpit speakers. "Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up." GPWS, the ground proximity warning system, saw something that the pilots did not see. Not with eyes, but with an algorithm. Not with a map, but with the beam of a radio altimeter that bumped into a wall growing from below. But the captain was sure that the warning was false. He knew that this area could give Spigioi's alerts. I knew that GPWS had recently been switched to inhibit mode due to a problem with the flaps. I knew that with steep valleys, the area under the plane often changes dramatically. He knew too much about false alarms, and too little about the fact that this time the alarm was real. The first officer, hearing the signal, leans forward sharply. "Turn back. Get back." There's more than just urgency in his voice. It's fear. He finally understood the scale of the discrepancy between the numbers and the real world. Captain Suho, false, false, and switches the mode to level change as if intending to gain altitude, but not doing what is prescribed by the GPWS system. Does not pull the steering wheel, does not give the command to maximize thrust, does not initiate a rescue maneuver. The plane is still going almost exactly 11,500 feet. The relief beneath it is growing much faster. GPWS continues. Terrain, terrain, pull up, pull up, pull up. The system screams. She's not warning anymore. She's begging. But the crew is still trying to sort out their internal map. They are confident that they are above the safe sector to the south. In their head, even if the terrain is growing, this is still the place where false signals are normal. The reality is that they fly into a mountainous dead end, where nothing can turn the car around. 17 seconds after the first warning, the clouds suddenly burst. There is no valley in front of them, not a hillside, not a soft foggy wall. In front of them is a huge, almost vertical gray-black mountain plain. The wall is 1.5 kilometers high. Baden-Powell Massif. The mountain bursts through the cabin window with such speed, as if it were moving towards them. The pilots see it literally for a split second. A short sob is heard in the cabin, almost childish, half suppressed. Oh no! And that's it. Impact. The Airbus A310 meets the rock at a speed of over 230 knots. The wings enter the rock like a knife into a cloth. The fuselage shatters into pieces in an instant, and the huge white-purple car turns into a chaotic scattering of metal, which the wind instantly envelopes in fog. 113 people die at once, so fast that they don't have a second to figure out what's going on. Dispatchers continue to call Thai 311 on the frequency. They are still sure that the plane went south. They still think they're talking to a crew that's just lingering or silent. But the plane has already been torn to shreds on the sheer mountain wall, where a human foot can hardly reach. And a new part of this story begins, the part in which the sky is silent, and the earth does not give its answers for a long time. On the street, far below the impact site, residents of the mountain villages heard a dull rumble, as if a block of stone had fallen off the slope and rolled through the gorge, muffling the echo. In the conditions of the Himalayas, such sounds are not uncommon. Avalanches, scree, ice movements. No one thought about the plane. No one connected this sound with a car that crashed on a vertical slope at an altitude of almost 6,000 meters. The air here is so thin that even the echo sounds different, hoarse, short, as if someone had strangled it. And the dispatchers in Kathmandu kept calling Thai 311. They repeated the call sign, as if it could bring the plane back on the air. Thai 311, Kathmandu Tower, report your position. Silence. Another challenge. Again 0. According to their idea of what was happening, the flight should have been somewhere in the south, heading for Romeo. Perhaps it had not yet managed to enter the area of the next dispatcher. The logic of procedural control without radar makes silence seem normal. Sometimes the crews switch frequencies later, sometimes they forget to report, sometimes they just try to deal with the situation in the cockpit. Nothing unusual, nothing that directly indicates a disaster. The first disturbing thoughts appeared only after a few minutes. But these were not thoughts of a collision with a mountain, but rather that the crew could leave the zone. Delayed. He doesn't hear. Clumsily switched over. There are so many shadow zones in the sky around Kathmandu that it still seemed plausible. The first person to sense something was wrong was not the dispatcher, but the shift supervisor. He went to the console and quietly asked a colleague, "Are you sure you heard their report? They should have been further south. Maybe they switched." But time passed. Thai 311 did not appear on any frequency. While people on the ground were trying to figure out where the plane had disappeared, a narrow trail of destruction spread out at the height of almost the sky. A ragged dark streak appeared on the gray steep slope of Baden-Powell, charred debris, fragments of a wing, twisted panels. Due to the height and terrain, all of this was invisible from most points of the valley. From the air, it was hidden by clouds. From the ground, it was incredibly far above accessible hiking trails. The mountain literally swallowed the plane. A few hours after the flight disappeared, the search began. A huge mistake in the direction of the search will become apparent only after a while. All the first groups were heading south, where the plane was supposed to be. No one believed that a modern airliner could go north, to a place where even helicopters are sometimes afraid to fly. At night, search engines set up tents in low valleys. Helicopters hovered over gorges. Phrases flashed on radio networks. There is no signal. Debris is not visible. The crash site has not been found. And it was only on the second day that rescuers received a strange message from a small village far to the north. People saw a bright flash over the mountains. We heard thunder. We felt a vibration. The helicopters took off again, but now they were heading where no one had even looked before. When they saw the crash site, the helicopter pilots took their breath away. It was as if the mountain had cut the plane in half and scattered it over a narrow stone shelf. Access is almost impossible. The height is more than 5,600 meters. The air is icy and thin, and every step takes strength. The slope is so steep that the rescuers were forced to cling to ropes, literally working on the back of the world. And yet they were rising. But when we got to the place, it became clear that there could be no survivors. There weren't even bodies in the usual sense. There was metal, the patches, fragments, broken human stories. The work of the investigators in these conditions was not only difficult, it was dangerous. One of the team members later died of altitude sickness. This is the rarest case when an investigation itself took the life of a specialist. They worked slowly, step by step, as if they themselves were afraid to disturb the silence that hung in the air after the impact. They reconstructed the trajectory from the wreckage, trying to assemble a picture of the destroyed aircraft in the same way as they would later assemble a picture of the crew's thoughts. And the more they found, the clearer it became. The plane was working properly. The navigation was working. The engines were working. The instruments were working. Only the human picture of the world did not work, the one that exists in the minds of two people when reality begins to adjust to expectations and not vice versa. But in order for the investigation to be able to say this confidently, it was necessary to go through another path, the path through the recordings of negotiations, through the data of the parametric recorder, through a careful comparison of every phrase, every altitude change, every radio signal. And when the whole puzzle finally came together, the conclusions turned out to be terribly clear. Thai Airways 311 did not hit the mountain. He thought the mountain wasn't there. He thought he was flying south. He thought he was showing the right numbers. He thought he was following the correct procedure. It was not a disaster of technology, but of human perception. The catastrophe of confidence that replaces doubt. The catastrophe of communication which has ceased to be a dialogue. The disaster of two experienced pilots who were trapped by their own logic. And now, decades later, we can sort it out. But then, at that moment, they didn't have that luxury. And the worst part is that they didn't even have a chance to realize that everything had already gone wrong, where the line between "I'm in control of the situation" and "we're lost in the sky over the Himalayas" runs. The next part of the story is not about mountains and clouds. It's about people, about how two professionals could be trapped in the same thought, about how a system without radar became blind, about why CRM is not soft skills, but the last line of defense between man and mountain. When the investigators finally reach this impossible altitude, where the air burns their lungs and every step feels like a march through the sand, it became clear that what happened in the last minutes of the flight could not be explained in terms of accident or instrument error. It wasn't an engine failure or a sudden fire. The car was in good working order right up to the very moment of the collision. The plane flew and obeyed, but the crew gave him commands based on a false picture of the world. And this false picture was so convincing to both pilots that even objective instruments, even navigation information, even the screams of the GPWS system could not break through it. The investigators took away the flight recorders, a black box and a parametric recorder. When they opened the recordings of the conversations from the cockpit, an almost theatrical scene appeared in front of them. Not with screams, not with panic, but with a quiet and very human chain of mistakes. The audio recording was not dramatic. On the contrary, she sounded casual, even stern. But that was exactly the horror of it. The captain speaks in an even voice. The first officer responds just as smoothly. Both sound confident and focused. There is no hysteria, no harsh intonation, no fear. Only at the very end, one single voice, short, without air. Oh no! It was the moment when, for the first and last time, the false picture of the world collided with reality, which cannot be denied. They saw a mountain. They saw death. Everything else didn't matter anymore. The investigation gradually gathered a chain of causes, turning the crumbling elements into a single fabric, as if carefully sewing up a ragged trail of events torn in the mountains. The main conclusion was harsh and unambiguous. The crew had completely lost their navigational situational awareness. Not because he didn't know the procedures, not because I haven't seen the map, not because he made a rude maneuver, but because he sincerely believed that he saw the right picture. And this belief led to the following consequences. All instrument readings were interpreted as a malfunction if they did not match the internal logic. FMS was considered incorrect when he pointed out the need to turn back. A decrease in DME and its subsequent increase was not recognized as a sign of crossing the VOR. Heading 025 degree, radial data and topographic minima have not been compared with the actual situation. The co-pilot, who was supposed to be the controlling voice, was too indecisive to insist on his own. The captain, overloaded and annoyed, took over the controls, the radio, the decision, and the analysis, and thus overloaded himself to the point of logic failure. This disaster has become a textbook example of what is called confirmation bias. When a person considers his picture to be true, he will discard any evidence to the contrary in order to preserve his inner integrity. The pilots did not make a mistake. They sincerely believed that they were doing everything right. When the commission addressed the issue of CRM interaction in the crew, it became clear that the atmosphere in the cabin could be outwardly calm, but internally unequal. The captain was more determined, more persistent. The co-pilot was gentle, prone to doubt, but not to voice these doubts. Even when he said softly and anxiously, "Are we going north?" the captain crossed out this attempt at realization with one movement. It was the last chance to expand the logic. The last moment when at least someone could say, "Stop, let's double, check everything from scratch." But in aviation, from scratch means removing emotions, removing assumptions, removing authority and titles, and looking at instruments as the only source of truth. And to do that, you need one thing: the courage to doubt. It is precisely this courage that CRM has been trying to instill in pilots for almost 40 years now. Not just the ability to speak, and the ability to ask even if you're afraid of a backlash. The ability to challenge even when talking to the captain. The ability to offer an alternative even if it goes against your gut. The TG-311 lacked that courage. The investigators looked at the torn pieces of metal, the torn fuselage, and the dark scar on the almost vertical mountain wall, and realized that none of those inside had even had time to realize that they were dead. It was a harsh, cold-blooded death instant, inevitable, mechanical, and this is a strange, almost inhuman tragedy. But it is precisely such tragedies that become turning points in aviation. After Flight TG311, the introduction of GPS navigation accelerated. Kathmandu's procedures have been reviewed. The approaches have become GPS-based, with precise positioning. EGPWS replaced the old warning systems. CRM has become not just a formal training, but a culture. Now the pilot can see the terrain ahead on the screen, as clearly as if the mountain was directly in front of the glass. Now the system will warn you in advance, instead of in the last 17 seconds. Now the crew, anywhere in the world, knows that any dissonance between the device and the sensation is a signal to stop and double-check. The memory of the TG311 now lives not only on the pages of reports. She lives in every entrance to a complex airport, in every CRM briefing, in each step of navigation. She lives in what the pilots now know. The most dangerous thing in the sky is not thunderstorms, wind, or mountains. The most dangerous thing is when you are sure that you are flying correctly, and at the same time you stop listening to the world around you. This flight is not just a tragedy. It's a quiet reminder of the fragility of human perception, that even the most experienced, calm, balanced people can get lost in the fog of their own beliefs, and that sometimes the only voice that could change everything is too quiet. In the evening, a few weeks after the tragedy, when the mountains were already covered with heavy clouds again, and the stone dampness of the Himalayas gradually covered the traces of debris, a small, quiet ceremony was held in Kathmandu. It was unofficial. There were no cameras on it. Only a few representatives of the airline, local residents, and those who participated in the search. They were looking north, to where the very slope that had become the last point of the route for Flight TG311 was hidden among the clouds. The wind lifted the dust, as if to remind, this is a territory where nature is always stronger than man. But the truth is, this disaster wasn't about grief. It was about people, about how one wrong step in communication between pilots turns a confident trajectory into a deadly path, about how one misinterpreted report makes the sky empty, the fact that technology can be perfect, but a person is always much more complicated. When the CRM experts analyzed the investigation, they looked at the recording of the negotiations for a long time. Not at the words as such, but at the pauses between them. The way the voice sounded, the tension that seeped through the short phrases, and, most importantly, what was missing from these negotiations. There was no phrase, "I don't understand." There was no phrase, "Let's check it again." There was no phrase, "It doesn't add up. Let's stop and figure it out." Words that save more often in aviation than actions. CRM is not about softness. It's about the ability to stop chains of errors before they become irreversible. About breaking the confirmatory distortion, the very thought catcher that keeps a person confident that everything is going according to plan, even when the world screams the opposite. Now they understand this more than ever. And this is the legacy of the TG311. Every time pilots enter a complex airport, they now speak out loud. If something doesn't add up, tell me right away. Every time a new pilot takes the helm, they explain to him that his voice has the same power as the captain's voice. Every time someone sees a relief map on the screen red, yellow, bright, they know that somewhere back in 1992 there was a flight whose crew did not have this luxury. Now they have the tools. There are maps. There are satellite signals. There are EGPWS. There are accurate GPS navigation systems that show the position literally with an accuracy of tens of meters. There is a culture where the first officer can say no to the captain. There is an understanding that the aircraft must be controlled not only by hands, but also by honesty. And all this is an echo of that very short, tragic flight. But the most important legacy of the TG311 is not only in technology, not only in procedures, not only in the red lines on the nav display. The point is that this tragedy has become a reminder of the subtlety of the human mind. That a safe flight is not the result of confidence, but the result of doubt. That the best pilot is the one who is willing to admit that he may be wrong. That the best crew is not the one where the captain is always right, but the one where the co-pilot is not afraid to correct him. TG311 is a story in which there was no malice, there was no incompetence, there were no failures that would have left the crew without a chance. It was a story of confidence that turned deadly. That's why it's so important. If you listen to the wind over those valleys, you can almost hear the echoes of the past. The sound of turbines, the staccato voice of the dispatcher, the monotonous GPWS signal. They are there, not because anyone remembers them, but because aviation itself has absorbed these lessons. Today, every flight that passes over the Himalayas, over the Alps, over the Andes, over any difficult terrain, flies a little safer thanks to those who died on TG311. Every visit to Kathmandu is a different story now. Every course, every radial, every fuel conversion is protected by the experience of the past. And maybe that's the only light in such dark stories. Tragedies become the foundation for future rescues. And the memory of 113 passengers and crew members of Thai Airways Flight 311 is not just a number. It is a quiet voice that will accompany every cabin, every briefing, every entry, reminding, the most dangerous thing in the sky is not the fog or the mountains. The most dangerous thing is to be confident when you need to doubt.